All right, let's kick things off. Again, welcome back if you're coming back for the fifth time in our series of mitigating bias in analytics. If this is your first event, thank you for joining us. Today we are covering the industry use case of mitigating bias in analytics, and we have an amazing speaker today, Clara Kreidler from Root Insurance, and I'm really excited to talk about some of the practical components of all the concepts we've talked about in the other events during this series. Real quick, before we get into the good stuff, I'm going to go through the agenda, do some high-level introductions and overview of the series, and then we will get started. So we'll have time for about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A with the audience. So please, as you come up with questions, go ahead and enter them in, and then we will get to them towards the end. And then finally, I will show you all how to get access to the recording for this so you can share it with your friends and colleagues. And at the end, we do have an optional networking session for about 20 minutes. So keep your eye out for a link in the chat that you can use to move over to the Zoom meeting so that we can all hear each other and talk to each other and discuss some of these concepts that we're going to cover today. So just a quick overview of this series. This is a series we've done in partnership with Tableau. And it is a virtual series featuring panel discussions, fireside chats, discussing ways to identify and mitigate bias in the analytics process. So we have one more event coming up in this series in 2 weeks. So keep your eye out for the registration link for that. And a little bit about women in analytics. So we exist to provide more visibility to women in the analytics space. We love to highlight the conversations around advancements of analytical research, development, and applications. We also just recently launched our membership platform. There is a free version of that, so feel free to check that out on our website at womeninanalytics.com. I'm going to hand things over for a second to Lilia from Tableau.
Thanks, Reagan. I'm excited to be able to partner with Women in Analytics. Grateful to be here. If you're not familiar with Tableau, we are a visual analytics technology that allows you to unleash the potential of your people and your data. So it's a beautiful partnership that we have here with WIA. Also in my role, I'm passionate about bringing our community together in events that help us learn from each other and uplift underrepresented voices in tech. One little plug I'll give everyone, if you haven't seen already, we have launched our Tableau conference completely online and completely free. So this is October 6th through 8th. I just saw that Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to be speaking. We've got brain date sessions with other data and analytics fanatics. So if you haven't already, go check that out. It's at tc20.tableau.com. And thank you again to everyone. I'm really excited to learn today from all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Lilia. And thanks again to Tableau for this amazing partnership for this event series. We really appreciate the support. Finally, on some housekeeping items, so webinar tips, if you're having audio issues, there's the email. If you have any questions, feel free to ask away. We love questions. We want to engage with the audience. If you're ready to participate, keep an eye out for a poll. And if you're up for some networking, as I mentioned, we're going to send the link in the chat. And with that, we can get to the good stuff. So thanks for bearing with me through that. I'd like to introduce Clara Kreidler. She is the Director of Product and Pricing at Root Insurance. Clara, thanks so much for being here and welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to do this. This is my first time doing a speaking engagement virtually. So I am fully prepared to have no audience feedback and just take it in stride. I was asked to share a little bit about my journey, which has been a very windy one. I am now, as Reagan said, the Director of Product and Pricing at Root Insurance, but I started at Root as the 15th employee working primarily on recruiting engineers. And as the business continued to grow, well, there was more opportunity. And so Root being the kind of place that's very merit-based, if you are performing well, there's oftentimes additional opportunity that will come. And one thing led to the other, and I was overseeing all of recruiting, all of HR, real estate, internal IT, and total rewards. So grew to an organization of about 35 people. My whole time in that VP of people role, I was reporting to the CEO, and it was an incredible experience. But having a background in science and some engineering, the people space is nothing that I ever intended on getting into, but it's just where the opportunity presented itself. And we did a lot of interesting things to bring data and process into what we were doing, which was certainly necessary as we grew the company to almost 1,000 employees now. So clearly, when you're bringing in, just last year, 600 employees, and we hire about 2% of people that get in contact with us, there's a lot that you need to figure out from a technical perspective, the software that supports it, et cetera. So I had a technical slant to what I was doing, but this new position that I'm in, that I'm very excited about, is way more technical. And definitely want to give the caveat as I go through this conversation that I am not even yet at month 2. But having been at the company for 4 years and having a really fast and thorough onboarding period, I think that there'll be plenty to share. And I'm excited to share some of the new things that I've learned with you guys.
Awesome.
I also was going to give an overview of Root, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, for sure. Root has an incredible story, so I'm really excited for you to share that.
Great. Yeah, thanks. It's been a whirlwind. So started in March of 2015. I joined in December of 16, and we've raised over $500 million to date. The last time we raised a round of funding was in 2019, and that valued us at about $3.65 billion. So just stating those numbers kind of to give some scale to what we've built. The premise of Root is to use telematics to more accurately price people in insurance. And I don't know how many people that are listening have exposure to insurance and how it's typically priced, but at a very high level, it's very difficult to price an individual without telematics data. And so what ends up happening is we create a bunch of assumptions and bucket people in like groups and say, okay, our goal is just to essentially make money on this bucket. And within that, there is a lot of dispersion of actual actual risk propensity. And so what happens is the people, a large portion of those people end up paying more than they should for the people that are actually very risky. So all to say, telematics is way more predictive. And so that's really the crux of what we've built Root Insurance around. Telematics wasn't, hasn't been an option way into the past. It's more of a recent thing that we can tap into, and especially doing so through the mobile phone, which is even further differentiating us. So you might know of like Snapshot with Progressive, that they have the OBD, you plug it into your car and then monitor your driving that way. That's great, but not all cars have OBD devices. Sometimes it's confusing how to install that. And so we've eliminated that barrier by having this mobile app on your phone that uses the sensors on your phone, think gyroscope, GPS, magnetometer, et cetera, to pull information based off of your actual behavior to inform how we're going to price you as an individual's risk.
Yeah, the telematics space is really fascinating, and I'm excited for you to kind of dive into that with Ashley as well, and how you're using some of that data and why it's important, to your point, on emphasizing the usage of telematics data over other data sets. So before we get into that discussion, I want to get a little bit of participation from the audience and launch a poll quickly. So, and I'm allowing panelists to vote as well. So if you'd like to vote, feel free. So I'm going to launch this poll. If you can go to your screen, there's a little window that should have popped up. The question says, do you currently have a challenge getting your leadership to prioritize evaluating or addressing bias within your analytics initiatives? And I'll wait just a few seconds for everyone to answer, and then we can share the results. All right, any last minute votes? Awesome. Okay, sharing results. So we had about 31% say yes, 31% say no, and 38% say I'm not sure, which is totally acceptable. Awesome, thank you for participating in that. And with that, I'm gonna hand things off to Ashley and Clara for the rest of our session.
Awesome, thanks Reagan. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time. So during this session, we are going to discuss a use case around mitigating bias and analytics, specifically one in which Root Insurance not only designed and executed on, but really one that is leading the insurance industry, where specifically attributes like credit scores are being removed from a model to address bias and discrimination within insurance. So Claire, can you take a couple minutes and kind of walk us through this use case and what it meant for Root?
Sure. I am really excited about the topic of this conversation because this isn't just a use case that can be found in a few of our models hidden away somewhere. This is the premise of our business. This is our mission, is to reduce bias in insurance and to make it more fair. And like I said in the introduction, having access to telematics data, there's my cat, Radish. Having access to telematics data really is the thing that powers us to do this and rate at an individual level. So a little bit more tactically, the way that we gather telematics data is you download the app on your cell phone. You give us access to monitor your driving. There's a period of about 30 days. Sometimes it can be a little bit more or less, but let's just say 30 days where we monitor your driving. During that period, we're looking for things like hard brakes, how often you drive, are your routes regular, and then all of those go into consideration when we're looking at what is your risk going to be in the future. You could imagine that things like how you actually drive are going to be more predictive of future losses than things like credit score, right? But in the past, credit score has been heavily relied upon because it is very correlated, but it's not causal. So they've used that kind of as a proxy to infer some things about responsibility. And so with us at Root having access to this data, it really powers us. It really arms us to start stripping things away that can introduce more bias because they are correlated, but they aren't always fair, right? Because you could imagine that two people with the same exact demographic data, with the same exact credit score, can still drive very, very differently, but using historical and traditional models, they would actually be priced the same. And so by drilling into the individual behavior, again, just to further the point, it gives us the ability to make this more fair. And as a result, we can reward the good drivers so that they aren't paying more than they should just because of the demographics and other things that we're used to seeing in the industry that provide us the insights and kind of forward-looking predictive power.
Gotcha. Very, very interesting. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but one in particular is, so how is this model that Root is using, how is it basically disrupting the insurance industry? You know, I know that you mentioned a couple things that Progressive is doing, but how is this really proving to be a disruptor across the industry?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it's going to be a forcing function to a lot of other insurance carriers who aren't leveraging telematics to the extent that we are. We know that it's more predictive. We know that it's more fair and that we can price at the individual level. And so as our telematics footprint increases, it will force other auto carriers and insurance carriers to kind of get with the telematics whole, show, because having that access is going to give us an advantage. And for the individual or for the carriers who don't have it, they will eventually become adversely selected, where their pricing is not as specific, as tailored, as fair, and the consumer can see that. They know themselves better than their demographics will portray them. And so if we're able to say, we see you the same way that you see yourself because we understand your behavior, then that gives us more traction. And it, in turn, if other carriers aren't getting on the bandwagon of using telematics, creates adverse selection in the future. And another thing that it allows us to do is not all the things that I just mentioned, but in addition to that is by having this very predictive data source of telematics, we are able to be less dependent on things like credit score. So not only are we introducing something that is less biased, but it allows us to eliminate something that is biased. We just made the commitment to eliminate credit score from our rating plans by 2025, which is huge. We're the first carrier to ever do this. Progressive is the first group that initially brought credit into the pricing model. It is very correlated, it is very predictive, but again, it's not as powerful as telematics. And so while the top insurers, probably every single one that you could rattle off the top of your head, use credit score. It's typically in their top 3 variables that they rate with, you know, relying on credit most heavily. Those carriers are not able to remove that because it is so predictive. But with telematics, we're able to kind of replace it, and it goes way down our list. It already is today. It's way down our list on things that we use. It still is incorporated, but we've made the commitment to do rely on it less so over time, and then eventually 2025 get rid of it entirely. You know, the other thing that I want to mention with this is removing credit score is not the first thing that Root has done to reduce our bias in our algorithms. We already remove occupation, education, which are 2 other variables that a lot of other carriers use. So all of these things in combination are giving us a huge competitive advantage, but it really starts with telematics and having built it in the way that we did.
Gotcha. So around removing the credit scores and occupation, et cetera, within like the traditional model of pricing, are you guys still incorporating like previous driving records and that sort of thing?
Yes, we are. And that's a good question. And that goes back to the actual behavior, because past driving performance is still going to be predictive of future driving performance, right? The telematics is just an ongoing monitoring of more of the micro day-to-day behaviors, but things like how many accidents you've been in the past are predictive and do show tight causality to future behavior.
Gotcha. So can you kind of walk us through, Clara, the process that, you know, Root leadership took in identifying this as a model and how they had to, basically the steps they had to take to prioritize it and execute on it?
Sure. Well, from a telematics perspective, the case that was built there is, hey, we should start a business because this is who Root is, right? Root didn't exist independent of telematics is another way to say it. So we weren't an established carrier who said, oh, there's this big opportunity, let's go, you know, run this up the chain and see if we can get any bites, right? This is the core of who we are as a business, is making insurance more fair through using telematics. And then down the road, the predictive power of telematics has allowed us to further eliminate other things that introduce bias in our models. And so Alex Tim, our CEO, he had this idea. He worked at Nationwide prior to Root Insurance, has been very close to the insurance industry since a super young age, given family ties to the industry, and has just been passionate about it. He himself is an actuary. He is a fellow of the Actuary Society, extremely brilliant person, total visionary. And when this was brewing, this idea of telematics, and when all of a sudden you could collect this information from a cell phone, a lot of Root is just a matter of timing and him saying, here's an opportunity, let's connect these dots of understanding that telematics is predictive. Now we can get it through the smartphone, which means we're going to be closer to our customers, right? And so that case that you're saying of like, how did we get buy-in, was saying, hey, investment capital, do you guys want to invest in us? And luckily Drive Capital, our first investor, did write us a check essentially on day one, which gave us a runway to really prove out this concept.
Gotcha.
And then as it relates to credit score, you know, I think that this is a really important cultural thing, because changes like this, you have to have an openness within your organization to really question the way that things are built, not just as it relates to bias, but across the board. It does take a special place that is excited about kind of peeling back the layers of the onion and saying, how can we do this better? Looking at work that you or your peers, whoever built within your company, and say, let's look at that. How can we do it better? And this credit score component of what we're building is a really good example of this. Isaac Espinoza, who's our VP of reinsurance, who works in the Cayman Islands, he saw this as an opportunity for us, knowing the predictive power of telematics, knowing that there was a lot of opportunity to continue eliminating bias from our models, being very sensitive to the social climate right now, and kind of the rightful begging from everyone to do better. It kind of all converged in him pulling together a group and getting traction around this idea of drop the score, which is dropping of the credit score. And so when you ask, what does it take to get this kind of buy-in? A lot of it is going to be cultural. A lot of it is to kind of prove your case that it is going to be additive to the business. And, you know, luckily at Root, we have all of those things.
Awesome. So kind of switching gears here to other parts of the business, as you're currently in pricing, and I know that you were previously the VP over people when you joined Root. Can you kind of give us some insight into the thought process and evaluating AI as a solution for other parts of the business, like HR, and the potential risks associated with that?
Yes. This is definitely a hot topic on the people side. One of the areas that comes to mind as being discussed the most is with psychometrics and personality screening and cognitive screening. Root has done a little bit of this, but it's definitely something tested much further beyond Root. We've been growing very quickly, and so much of what we're doing is just how do we get the right people in the door as fast as possible. We haven't had a large data set and a dedicated team to figuring out what models can actually predict whether someone's going to be successful in their role. But I know that there is a large contingency of folks out there that focus on this 100% of their working time. Not only is it the cognitive and the personality tests that are being done, I've read about things like monitoring video chats where it would interpret my cadence of conversation, the tone of my voice, all of these things to try and predict future performance. I think that there is certainly room for building algorithms, especially when you need to scale very quickly. In some ways, it can present a more level playing field for candidates coming in who, you know, we've probably all read studies that if you're left to your own devices, most people will hire people that look and sound and act like them, right? That is incredibly biased. So if you have these other methods of collecting information that are blind to all of those things, and they're taking into account specific characteristics of your personality and your cognitive ability, in a lot of ways, it strips some of those biases. But on the other hand, you have the risk that those models themselves are biased, right? I think a great example of this is with Amazon. They built basically something that was going to scrape resumes and predict whether someone's going to be successful in their role. And they found, I think it was in 2018, I think, they found that people were not being evaluated on a gender neutral basis. While they weren't explicitly taking into account gender, other factors were so tightly correlated with gender. And because past applicants were training their models, and so many of the technical applicants were male, it started skewing in the favor of those individuals, because you have 100 people that apply, 80 of them are male. Let's say that 5% across the board are getting hired, fewer women are going to actually get through if it's 5% across, right? So it's starting to build some correlation to gender that was not intended. So that whole effort was disbanded because they found that these things are actually very, very difficult to do. And while there are industries that are dependent on building models for customers, they felt that the risk of applying these same approaches to potential employees just was not the type of precedent that they wanted to create with the folks that could be joining their company. So I think there's certainly places for AI. It can eliminate a certain type of bias, but like any model, you have to be very, very keenly aware of the biases that model itself introduced.
Very interesting. I can see how that would be a bit of a hot topic for sure.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
I know that we have some of our audience is representing different industries. I know higher education, obviously IT. We have some financial services folks with us on. You know, just kind of thinking of the broader spectrum around all these different industries. I mean, from your experience, Clara, do you know, have you heard of, any particular industry potentially, leveraging AI within the hiring context more so than others? Just trying to kind of give some different perspective from those from different industries with us today.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert in that, but I will say anecdotally, the places that I hear about it the most are in tech. So my brother works for Google. I have friends who have worked or do work at Facebook. I've read a bunch about Amazon's hiring practices, and certainly they're looking to find an edge with what is already their proficiency in building software, building models, using data, massive, massive amounts of data to get their intended result or insight. And so maybe it's because I've spent most of my career in tech, so I have a very specific purview, but from what I've gathered, at least anecdotally, it's primarily in tech.
Gotcha. So with that, I think we wanted to open up the forum to any questions that we have for the group. I don't know if when Reagan was potentially going to, if she's going to share any more poll questions, but I think that we might transition over to some questions for the audience.
Yeah, and I definitely have some questions for you too. And I really appreciate your perspective on this, Clara, because one of our previous events, somebody was like, hey, I'm really looking for an example where this went well, because there's so many examples out there where it did not go well. Like you just named the Amazon one. We've all probably read about the facial recognition technology that is extremely biased. And so I think it's really refreshing to see one that is going well and one we can point to. And I had a couple of questions too. So you had mentioned taking things out of the algorithm like credit score. And what's interesting about algorithms is that they drive incentives. So if somebody's trying to, influence the algorithm to give them a better driving score or to give them a better overall score, you're using something where it's directly impacting their driving behavior as opposed to something like a credit score that they can't control. Are there other factors that you can think of in the model that might also determine, items that or variables that they may not have a lot of control over, like their zip code or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's trade-offs, right? Because something like zip code, let's just take that as an example, while you could be pigeonholed based off of that, something that you might not be able to control, and a lot of insurance companies will put weight into that zip code and assumptions around other things like connection to credit score or earnings or other things like that. It's also a very useful tool in determining weather. and other components, you know, that location specifically will give us insight into that do impact future losses, right? You could imagine that if a place where there are a bunch of hurricanes, that's probably going to be good for us to know, right? So I think where we go from here is going to be a really important question, and how we continue to find opportunities for us to kind of chip away at the things that people can't control. Zip code in particular is just an interesting one, because on one side it's something that you totally want to eliminate because people can't control it to a degree, but it's also giving us other insights independent of what it might assume regarding your socioeconomic status or whatever else that is very important for us to know. And so, yeah, I honestly, I don't know where it goes from here, but I think that that's the right question to be asking, is how we chip away at it.
Yeah, and I think what's really fascinating too is the fact of how you're talking through it. I think it's an example of what types of conversations and questions and discussions companies should be having, because a lot of times it's data scientists sitting in a room looking at the data set, determining what's going to statistically get them to where they need to be from a modeling perspective. But what kind of larger conversations are the data science teams and potentially product managers having to ensure that these types of conversations are happening?
Yeah, luckily it's not something that we're having to encourage too much. You hear in every leadership conversation that it all starts from the top. And fortunately for us, Alex being such a quant, he really forces that, not in like a bad way, but he encourages that, makes room for that, and certainly encourages, yeah, the that type of conversation. It's the expectation at Root that you will be thinking through this type of lens. Like I said at the beginning, the crux of our business is to make insurance more fair. And so if you joined the company, you're joining that mission, and it'll show up in your work. And if it doesn't, then maybe there's a misalignment between your values and ours. But we're very lucky that it's not something that we have to task some SWAT team with. Okay, now you care about bias and fairness, okay? Are you joining Root? Okay, that means you have to care about fairness. So.
Yeah, that's awesome, because it's funny. And again, one of the previous conversations, they talked about asking very specific ethical questions during the interviewing process. And that being a way, I believe it was in two events ago that was mentioned in the policies and standards. It was mentioned that the hardest thing to teach data scientists was this ethical lens and ethical view to have during this whole creation process. So are there any specific questions that you're asking candidates to get a gauge for that value alignment?
Yeah, I think, this is something that we certainly talk a lot about. At least I spent a lot of time discussing it when I was on the people team. And that in and of itself is a really, really tricky needle to thread, because by asking someone about their values in an objective way, it is impossible to keep it objective. Very quickly, it's going to become subjective. And so instead of focusing on what are your values, we focus on what are the building blocks that will show us whether or not we can actually create something with similar methodologies. And so our interviews are particularly technical and focused on the actual work that an individual would be doing at Root and evaluating their ability to do that. But not to the point where you have to understand our nomenclature and you have to know our tools in order to be successful. There's a balance in these things. For instance, with our engineers, when you go through the process of interviewing with us, there's a work sample and we lay out exactly what we want. It's fairly high level, leaves a lot of room for interpretation based off of what you want to showcase to us. And we don't prescribe what language you actually code in, right? Because we don't want it to be unnecessarily prohibitive to people who are great engineers, do build things in a way that we can align with, but might not know the specific language that we're in. to us, the languages that you use, kind of the things that can be learned are not as important. It's more so, how are you, what are the methods that you are applying to your work, and then making sure that that is consistent with the methods that we deploy throughout our business. And I'll also say that on the topic of values, and this is something that there's a lot of different schools of thoughts on, my perspective is you don't have to have the same values. You just need to have enough overlap that you can leverage one another's work, right? I never want to turn a candidate away because they're not good at presenting or something. It's like, well, if that's not core to your job, why are we even considering it, right? And so I think it's about defining what is actually essential. What are the things that we need to know to determine whether or not they're going to be successful at that work? And then what are the things that are tangential, and try really hard to steer away from the things that are tangential, outside, or subjective.
Yeah, I picked up on a theme of Root wanting to get to the essentials.
Yeah.
That's great. We do have a couple of audience questions, so I'm going to ask those now, and then we can always get back to my long list. One question is, I have heard of companies who help you boost credit score by taking into account information about your rent payment history. What do you think is the effect of that on those algorithms that do use credit score as input?
Man, well, certainly you have more control over your rental payments. And so from that aspect, that you can make a quicker turnaround. Credit scores are not something that are extremely fluid, especially over time. And so having the opportunity to say, okay, I'm righting my wrongs or turning a corner, or whatever it is, and say, here's a different data set that I want to stand as a proxy for me. I think it does make sense. I'm going to be biased to just removing it in general and sticking more towards the actual behavior behind the wheel, but I see there being value in that as well.
Another question we have from the audience says, did you experience resistance from consumers regarding privacy of data, particularly around sharing phone geolocation data, and how did you overcome that?
This is an ongoing conversation, most definitely. Our customers have a lot of questions about that. I myself, when I downloaded Root, was like, okay, what are you doing with my data? Because it's pretty vulnerable position if someone knows all of the movements that you've been making. We've tried to mitigate a lot of their concerns by being very upfront with how are we actually utilizing this data? Who are we and are we not sharing it with? We keep all of our data close to our chest. We are not selling it for marketing purposes or anything like that. For us, we don't need to be, selling our data to make a profit. Our game is insurance, right? This isn't Facebook who needed to figure out how to become profitable, and so they just go and sell space on their website. Our vehicle towards profitability is insurance. We think that telematics is the thing that's going to differentiate us in the market. And so what we do with that data, given the fact that there are so many concerns from our consumers, keeping that close to us is definitely something. Maybe we're ignoring some other potential revenue streams, but it's helping our credibility with our customers. So it has and will continue to be a topic of conversation. But I also think that kind of at a macro level, the consumer's tolerance to sharing information is changing pretty rapidly. I don't know if you guys remember when the first iPhone came out and people were all of a sudden taking pictures with their phone. Personally, when I was in the background of the phone, I'm like, oh my God, who are you and what are you going to do with that picture? And now it happens all the time. I'm like, hey, photobombing them. And so we just build this tolerance. And so I think it'll continue to be a topic of conversation with our customers. It is a very scary thing before you have the opportunity to be educated on how we're utilizing the information. I think over time, the concerns will diminish.
Along that note, are there certain regulations in the insurance industry that require, if someone is denied, a quote from you, that require you to tell them why?
Yes. So the FCRA, I think it stands for Federal Credit Rights Act or something like that. They have a bunch of rules around when you have to send notices to your consumers based off of why you made certain decisions. And it's not just credit. So let's say, like in the case of credit, you take in consumers' information. If you're using that to price insurance, let's say they had bad credit, so you want to charge them more, that would trigger the need to send a notice to that consumer that we use that information and it negatively impacted them. Other things that would go into this are just like general consumer reports. So if we're looking at previous loss history, that would be another thing that we would need to disclose. In regards to telematics specifically, as far as I'm aware, again, I'm still getting up to speed on this, month 2, there aren't, from what I understand, kind of overarching governance on when we need to tell customers about how we're utilizing telematics at certain points in time. But there are places like California where you can't even write on telematics to begin with. So that's going to be a very interesting state for us to figure out come 2025 when we can't use credit score, which is currently one of the predictive components of our models, to figure out like how do we continue to have really strong pricing practices without using that biased piece of that biased input of credit score. And so there's work that we're doing and trying to push really hard to build the tolerance for telematics in California, but working with regulators is a tricky thing. One thing that I'll mention, just given the fact that I brought up California, that's important to note in these conversations is insurance is regulated at the state level. So every state has a Department of Insurance that decides what you can include and what you have to exclude from how you price people. So as I've been talking about how we price insurance, it's not like we're trying to figure out one perfect model that we're constantly fitting against. And then that's our silver bullet. We have to do that for every single market that we're in because the variables that we're even allowed to rate with to begin with vary. So it's a tricky industry. It's ever evolving.
Yeah, I know transparency is a huge conversation in consumers having more trust and faith in organizations and how they're using the information. So it is a really interesting topic for sure. And it's also very interesting that California is pushing for, no use of telematics data when in fact, to your point, it is forcing insurance companies to use more bias variables to try to figure out how to predict prices on people. So it's kind of counterintuitive
Right.
from that perspective. We got another.
Yeah, you should be our lobbyist.
Done. Deal. We got another question from the audience. Does Root purge any sensitive geolocation information, or do you hang on to it? And are there regulations around obtaining that?
Unfortunately, I have not made it that far in my onboarding. I'm not going to be able to answer that question.
That's fair. I want to touch back on one of the cultural pieces too, because I just think this is so fundamentally important. You find a lot of, Root is how old? 6 years?
Yeah, ish.
Yeah. And you, like you said, you started with this mantra. And not all companies really do. And so if you look at some of these companies that are like 50, 100 years old, they're trying to pivot and make changes. And culturally, I think that shift looks pretty, scary for a lot of them. And so I want to kind of emphasize and ask you, is the leadership team's knowledge and background, not only in this industry, but from a technical perspective, an advantage? because I hear a lot of pros and cons from or at least arguments that, you know, C-level executives don't necessarily have to know the details. They don't need to be technical. And I think that kind of hinders their ability to make big decisions like this and understand its importance. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Our executive team is extremely involved in a very positive way. They all have their own unique skill set that is inclusive of like strategic level leadership, of course. Work with some amazing people, but it's in all cases complemented by a skill set that they can apply in a technical capacity. So whether it's our Chief Brand Officer, Kelly Ruff, digging in and helping evaluate some creative that we're doing, or a commercial, and being very involved in the storyline, to, I don't know, like Dan Mingus who's our CTO and co-founder, making some decisions around some really important architecture that we're about to start building on the engineering side. They are so intimately involved in what we're doing. And I think that without that, we would not have been able to grow as quickly. So given the fact that we raised the capital that we did from Drive Capital at the very beginning, it gave us the ability financially to attract some exceptional people out of the gate. Our early team is now leading entire verticals within the business, key initiatives. And so we invested in that early team. And not only has that helped us from the perspective of, when you're growing this quickly, not everything is documented, right? There's not a ton of institutional, like it is all in your head. And so by bringing in people who we knew we could continue to rely on as we continue to grow, it gave us the benefit of not having to kind of restart on a lot of these things. The other benefit is the foundation that we set from the beginning is extremely solid. We weren't going out and saying, okay, we want to launch an insurance company. Let's go get, I don't know, like 10 people that are just starting to learn how to code and hope that they can figure it out, right? We matched a good idea with right timing in the market with exceptional talent. And so our code base from the beginning is something that we are still very proud of. We've made modifications and everything like that, but it gave us such a foundation to continue building on that was really critical to our ability to scale very quickly.
Yeah, and I think along those lines too, which is extremely impressive. I mean, just the scale that Root has seen over the last 6 years is, I mean, they called it a unicorn for a reason, right? It's got a lot of press because this is just, you know, not something that's very typical. And I think from a cultural perspective too, one of the big themes, overarching themes for this whole series has been getting diverse perspectives and diversity in the room to design and build these products. And so from that cultural perspective, you know, what does Root do to ensure that that's happening?
Oh my gosh, our executive team, again, starting with the top, is incredibly diverse, from age, sexual orientation, gender. We're either at 50-50 male, female, or skewing slightly female right now. Like every component of this, the industries that we've grown up in, it is so cool. It is like one of my favorite things about working at Root is all of the really interesting perspectives that are brought to the table. And what that does is it definitely creates an environment for a lot of debate, because you have smart people with different perspectives trying to solve the same problem, right? And so while there's that kind of like initial period of trying to get buy-in that can be a big moment of disagree and then commit, when we do commit, the solutions that we build are already so pressure tested just from kind of a conceptual level that when we go to start building it, a lot has already been kind of snuffed out. It is a truly remarkable characteristic of our company is that diversity, especially with Alex and his direct team.
In the tremendous growth that you've seen in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, has that been hard to maintain?
Well, if I were, sitting in the same seat 3 years ago and you told me that what we have experienced since then was ahead of us, I probably would have started sweating a little bit. But, at least from a personnel perspective, I don't know how this is the case, but it has felt relatively easy. Bringing in 600 people in a year, not something I thought would be easy, but the team, that the recruiters who we call candidate experience managers, and the onboarding folks, everyone that's involved with finding this talent, bringing them in the door, have just built such incredible processes that it's super, super smooth. So we've taken this big giant elephant and we're like, okay, what are all of the pieces at one bite at a time? And now, instead of having to figure that out each time a new role comes up, we've created systems that really make that entire process extremely repeatable. So yeah, it is remarkable. Even looking back now, it's like, oh my gosh, how did we do that? If you asked me today to go hire 600 people in 12 months, I'd be like, where do I start? But it's just one of those things where it had to happen. There was a business need. And so we just started solving it. And then you pick your head up and you had just accomplished some pretty amazing things. I remember one time in particular, Alex, our CEO, called me into his office at like 4 o'clock. Maybe it was like a Tuesday, I don't know. And he was like, hey, I don't remember the exact number, but I need 40 claims adjusters by tomorrow morning. And I was like, okay. And he was like, okay. And I was like, I mean, like you said you need it. So like, I just need to go do it. Right. And so we kind of all rallied together and we figured it out. We made it happen. But I think those are the kinds of moments where you're like, you don't have the opportunity to think anything other than how are we going to solve it. Right. So.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. And I think it's the cultural shift that a lot of existing companies is going to be a very challenging thing. I guarantee we're going to see a lot of kind of reinvention because to your point, like it really starts with the foundation.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I know we're nearing the end here. I wanted to give you, Clara, a couple of minutes to let people know how to like keep up with Root and what the future looks like for Root.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're currently selling in about 30 markets, so there's still a push to get nationwide. We recently launched homeowners insurance through a partnership with HomeSite, and we have renters insurance as well. So a great way to keep up with what we're doing is to become a customer. But I'm not here to sell that. I just think it's true. And obviously like we're a modern company. And so we're active on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, all of that. What's in the future for us beyond just that expansion? We're always keeping our ear to the ground for where the biggest opportunity is. I think that there's a ton that we can do. Obviously, I'm now biased myself being in the pricing space, but I think there's a lot that we can do in pricing to make sure that we are extremely competitive there. So I would say keep an eye out for even more advancements there. I'm not sure how much of them will be public, but certainly you'll be able to tell if we're doing a good job based off of how our market share changes. But I'm just really grateful for the time to chat with all of you today. This is like me doing my first speaking engagement with my training wheels on in my new role. So it was really fun. I appreciate all the questions and everything. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And thanks, Ashley, for prepping for the conversation as well. Really appreciate it. Yeah, this was an awesome conversation. I think it tied in really, really well to the overall theme of what we're discussing. And so just a couple of last things before people sign off. I'm going to post a link in the chat. If you click it, it will take you right out of here. So maybe copy paste it if you want to stick around for a second. But this is going to be the link that you'll click to go to the networking session. So if you are interested in sticking around for about 20 minutes afterwards and talking about this discussion, meeting other attendees from this event, feel free to join us there. And then one more component as well, I wanted to let you all know how to find the link to this recording. And I also wanted to let you know that we have our final event for this series coming up in 2 weeks. So we will be sending you all the link to this recording in a follow-up email. Again, feel free to distribute that to any of your friends or colleagues. And then we will be closing out this series in partnership with Tableau. Like I said, on October 14th, we're going to be closing it up with storytelling, and Helen is going to be joining us from the UK. So we'll be talking about how to mitigate bias in the art of storytelling with data. So like I said, if you would like to stick around, feel free to do so. And one more thank you to both of you for spending your lunch with me, and the rest of the audience as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Awesome.
Reagan. Thanks,
See
Clara.
you all at the networking session.
Sounds good. Thank you.